December's sky over New York was oppressive with low clouds foretelling snow. The cold wind howled in the alleys, catching on the corners of buildings and throwing icy needles into the faces of passers-by. People wrapped in warm scarves hurried along the sidewalks, turning up the collars of their coats, inhaling the scent of fresh snow mixed with the aroma of hot coffee and street food. At the corner of 7th Avenue and 43rd Street, between neon signs and bright shop windows, the cozy Jackson Diner shone. Behind its large glass windows, warm lamps glowed, their reflections playing on the metal counters and chrome edges of the chairs. Here it always smelled of something homemade: fried eggs, bacon, fresh bread. Inside there was the usual hum, the clatter of dishes, customer conversations, the sizzle of oil on the stove. Sarah Miller, a waitress with 2 years of experience and boundless dreams, deftly moved between tables, smiling at customers, pouring coffee, and remembering orders with a speed that could only be envied. She loved this job, despite the fatigue and calluses on her feet. Every day was another step towards her dream. She saved every extra bill in a jar labeled Art School, dreaming that one day her hands would hold not a tray, but a brush. And instead of the smell of bacon and coffee, she would be surrounded by the smell of fresh paints. But that evening, something changed. At the moment when Sarah was carrying 2 large burgers to a table by the window, there was a barely audible sound, the ringing of the door, short but sharp, as if someone had entered, not daring to go further. She looked at the entrance. Standing on the threshold was a man. His clothes were torn, too light for such weather. An old brown coat, unbuttoned, tattered jeans, boots that had long lost their shape. He was thin, so thin that his cheeks seemed to have sunken in. His eyes were empty, tired, but there was still something alive in them. The whole room noticed him. Some customers averted their gaze. Someone frowned, someone simply ignored his presence. Homeless people were not a rarity in New York, but everyone preferred to pretend they didn't exist. The man froze as if he didn't know what to do next. Sarah caught his gaze. Something tightened in her stomach. That look! She had seen it before, in those who had fallen so low that they stopped believing they could rise again. She set the tray of burgers on the customer's table and, without hesitation, approached the man. "Sir, are you hungry?" Her voice was soft but confident. The man blinked in confusion, as if not expecting to be spoken to. He awkwardly nodded. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." His voice was hoarse, barely audible. That was enough. Sarah turned, grabbed a menu from behind the counter, and gently but firmly guided him to the nearest table, next to the heater. "Sit down. I'll bring you something hot right away." The man obediently sat down, pulling his coat around him, as if trying to make himself smaller. His hands were shaking. Sarah returned to the kitchen. "Grill number 3 and double coffee, no sugar," she shouted to the cook, not even waiting for permission. The cooks exchanged glances but said nothing. They knew Sarah. Her stubbornness was unbreakable. A few minutes later, she placed a large plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans in front of the man. "Please eat," she said. The man slowly picked up the fork, his hand still shaking. When he took the first bite, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah just smiled and turned to continue her work. But at that moment, her boss, Mr. Doyle, came out of the kitchen. "Sarah!" His voice was so loud that the diner instantly froze. Conversations died down. Someone turned to look. Sarah's heart sank. "What are you doing?" His voice was cold, harsh. She gripped the tray tightly but remained in place. "He's hungry, Mr. Doyle. He needs lunch." Mr. Doyle's lips pressed into a thin line. He took a step closer. "Do you think this is charity?" There was cruelty in his voice, but Sarah did not avert her gaze. "The food will be deducted from your salary," he said slowly. "Moreover," he leaned in closer so everyone could hear, "you're fired." Silence. Sarah felt her face flush with heat. Her heart was pounding wildly, but she wouldn't let herself cry. She slowly untied her apron and carefully placed it on the counter. The homeless man looked at her in horror. "Miss, I didn't mean. I can leave." Sarah shook her head. "It's okay." She raised her chin and stepped out into the cold night. Snow had already begun to fall lightly. settling in a thin layer on the sidewalk. Sarah sat on a bench nearby, clutching the handles of her bag. How would she explain this to her neighbor? How would she pay the rent now? She took a deep breath, trying to hold back tears. 30 minutes passed. The cold seeped under her coat, but Sarah didn't move. It was at that moment that a black SUV pulled up to the diner. The door opened. Out stepped Keanu Reeves. And that evening, her life changed forever. The cold air of Manhattan grew more piercing with each hour. Sarah sat on a bench near the diner, her fingers clutching the handles of her bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She didn't feel the frost. Inside, everything was already frozen. She thought about how she would tell her neighbor that she had been fired, how she would pay the rent now. And now, all her dreams of studying at art school were shattering like fragile glass, broken by one careless move. But a strange feeling didn't leave her. She had made the right choice. And if she could turn back time, she would make it again. People in the diner continued their conversations as if nothing had happened. Sarah was sure that within a week no one would remember her, except perhaps the homeless man she had fed. She sighed and looked at the diner's door. At that moment, a black SUV smoothly pulled up to the curb. A man stepped out. Sarah squinted, her breath catching for a second. She knew that face. Even despite the simple clothes, a black coat, dark jeans, a modest hat, she recognized him immediately. Keanu Reeves. His walk was relaxed but confident. He looked around, his gaze lingering on her for a second, but he walked past, opening the glass door of the diner. Inside, there was silence. Sarah saw everything through the window. Customers froze. Someone nudged a friend. Someone tried to discreetly pull out their phone. People rarely saw stars of such magnitude up close, especially in an ordinary diner. But Keanu Reeves didn't look lost or surprised. He seemed to be looking for someone. His gaze slowly scanned the room until it stopped on the homeless man who was still sitting at his table, carefully finishing the last bits of food, as if afraid he would be chased away again. Keanu took a few steps towards him. "Excuse me, may I sit down?" The man started. His gaunt face reflected shock and confusion. He quickly nodded, as if unsure it was real. Keanu sat down across from him. "Did you like the food?" The man nodded, his eyes glistening with barely contained tears. "Yes, it was wonderful. But," he swallowed, lowering his head, "but the waitress, she was fired because of me." Keanu frowned. "She was fired?" There was disbelief in his voice, but underneath it was tension. The man struggled to raise his eyes. "I didn't even remember her name, but she was kind to me. I didn't know." He fell silent, his shoulders slumping. Keanu slowly inhaled. Then he turned to the counter where Mr. Doyle stood. The cafe owner looked nervous. "Are you the manager?" Keanu's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Mr. Doyle straightened, trying to look confident. "Yes, what's the problem, Mr. Reeves?" Keanu didn't take his eyes off him. "I heard you fired a waitress today." "For what?" Mr. Doyle hesitated. "She broke the rules. She gave away food for free." His voice faltered under Keanu's intense gaze. The silence in the diner grew heavier. Keanu slowly nodded, as if considering his words. Then he leaned forward, his voice softer but firmer. "You're running a business. I understand that. But to fire someone for kindness?" Mr. Doyle swallowed. "That's not just heartless. That's bad business." Silence. The whole room froze. Keanu looked straight at him, and Mr. Doyle clearly didn't know what to say. After a few seconds, Keanu slowly straightened. "You'll reconsider that decision. Trust me." With those words, he stood up and headed for the exit. People silently watched him go, but Keanu paid no attention to their gazes. He exited the diner, looked up, and found her. Sarah was still sitting on the same bench, her head bowed. He slowly approached her. The snow fell heavier, softly settling on his shoulders. He stopped in front of her, but didn't want to startle her. "Excuse me," Sarah started. She slowly raised her head, her red, cold-stung eyes widening in surprise. "You," Keanu smiled. "You're the kind waitress everyone is talking about." Sarah didn't know what to say. She was still in shock from what had just happened. How did you?" Keanu calmly sat down next to her on the bench. I was inside. I heard what happened. Sarah swallowed, looking away. I just wanted to help. Her voice trembled. I didn't think, I didn't know it would cost me my job. Keanu looked at her. Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than it should. His voice was soft but firm. But that doesn't mean you were wrong. Sarah clenched her fingers into fists. She didn't understand why this person was talking to her. Why he was here. Why did he care? She met his gaze. I don't even know why you're talking to me. Her voice grew softer. I'm nobody. Keanu leaned forward, his warm hand covering her trembling fingers. You're someone who chose kindness. His gaze became serious. And that makes you extraordinary. Sarah froze. Something inside shifted. Something melted. She didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time that evening, she felt hope. The snow fell heavier, swirling in the air and turning the streets of New York into a winter wonderland. People hurried about their business, wrapping themselves in scarves, making their way through the wind. And on a bench at the edge of the sidewalk sat Sarah, her heart still pounding from Keanu's words. She couldn't believe he was sitting next to her, looking straight at her, as if she mattered. You shouldn't think that way about yourself, Sarah, Keanu said gently. He knew her name. She blinked, not realizing she hadn't even introduced herself. I don't understand why you care. Her voice trembled, not from the cold, but from emotion. Keanu smiled slightly. Because I know what it's like to feel invisible. She looked at him, trying to see the truth in his eyes. You? He nodded. There were moments in my life when I felt I didn't matter, that everything I did was meaningless. His voice grew softer, but there was such sincerity in it that Sarah held her breath. But the kindness of people, even the smallest, changed me, saved me. She looked away, feeling something tighten in her chest. I just don't know what to do now, she whispered. I lost my job. I need to pay rent. And now, Keanu pulled out his phone. Let's take it one step at a time, he said, dialing a number. Sarah watched him, not believing this was happening. Who was he going to call? She heard him talking to someone on the other end, his voice calm and confident. Yes, she's here. Tomorrow morning? Great, thank you. He hung up the phone and looked at her. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. You'll go to a meeting. Sarah frowned. Where? He handed her a small card. On it was written, Hope Horizons, Center for Helping the Homeless and Needy. She blinked. What is this? A place where they'll offer you a job, Keanu said. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. But why? Why are you doing this? He looked at her intently. Because the world needs people like you. People who choose kindness. Sarah looked at the card in her hands. She didn't know what to say. She was sure of one thing. This evening had changed her life. Sarah woke up early, even before dawn. Her tiny apartment, which she shared with her best friend Lisa, was quiet, the streetlights flickering outside, illuminating the snowy streets. But despite the early hour, she couldn't sleep. Thoughts, chaotically swirling in her head, kept her from even closing her eyes. On the nightstand next to the bed lay that very card, Hope Horizons. Sarah carefully ran her finger over the embossed letters. Could she trust all this? Keanu Reeves was Keanu Reeves. Hollywood star, legend. Why did he care about her? Why did he think she could help this center? She took a deep breath. Lisa, her roommate, was already awake and stood by the stove, lazily stirring coffee. You're strange today, Lisa noted, lazily yawning. Sarah pursed her lips. I still can't believe what happened yesterday. Lisa set down the mug and crossed her arms. I still think it's a dream. You were fired. But then out of nowhere, Keanu freaking Reeves showed up and decided to save you? Seriously? Sarah shook her head. I don't think he was saving me. More like he saw. Lisa raised an eyebrow. And you're going to this center? Sarah nodded. I think so. I want to at least try. Lisa sighed, then mischievously smiled. Just don't fall in love with him. Sarah snorted. Don't make me laugh. But even as she said it, somewhere deep inside, there was a faint, barely noticeable flutter. Hope Horizons. By 10 o'clock, Sarah was already standing in front of the center's building. It was a modest two-story building in Brooklyn, surrounded by small trees dusted with snow. The sign above the entrance read, Hope Horizons, second chances for those who deserve them. She took a deep breath, gripping the handles of her bag tighter. This was a new step. Inside it was warm. The hallway smelled of coffee and freshly baked bread. Sarah saw several people, some in business attire, others in old worn coats, like the man from the diner. A middle-aged woman with short blonde hair approached her. Sarah? Sarah nodded. I'm Anna, the center's coordinator. Keanu told me about you. Come in, let's talk. She led her into a small but cozy office. Anna smiled. Keanu said you're special. Sarah blushed. I just wanted to help. I don't think that makes me special. Anna looked at her intently. Do you know how many people turn away when they see a homeless person? Sarah remained silent. You're not one of them. Anna paused, then continued. We help people who find themselves in difficult situations. We give them shelter, work, a chance. Keanu thought you have a heart that can help others. Sarah swallowed. Oh, but I don't know how to do anything. I'm just a waitress. Anna smiled. And do you know how many people in this center started from the same place? Sarah pondered. Maybe this path wasn't so bad after all. She took a deep breath. I'll try. Anna warmly smiled. Welcome to Hope Horizons, Sarah. At that moment, something inside her changed. She didn't know where this path would lead her, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel lost. The day started earlier than Sarah expected. Waking up the next morning, she lay in bed for a long time, trying to gather her thoughts. The world outside the window was quiet, snow still falling slowly, covering the streets of New York with a white blanket. Today was her first day at Hope Horizons. She had no idea what to expect. Sarah had never worked in charitable organizations, never dealt with the homeless, except for that one night in the diner. She didn't know what it was like to be a beacon of hope for those who had lost everything, but she decided to try. When she entered the center's building, Anna greeted her right away. How are you feeling? Anna asked with a kind smile. Sarah nervously adjusted her bag strap. Honestly, a little scared. Anna nodded understandingly. That's normal. Most people who come here for the first time feel the same way. But you know what the secret is? Sarah looked at her questioningly. Anna leaned in slightly and whispered, You've already done the main thing. You decided to be here. Those words stuck in her head. You decided to be here. That already means something. Anna led Sarah through the building, showing her the rooms. This is our dining hall where we feed those in need. Those are the temporary accommodation rooms. And this is our small art studio. Sarah paused at the last door. Through the glass, she saw several people, some sitting on old wooden stools holding brushes, others drawing with charcoal on large sheets of paper. For a second, Sarah forgot she was supposed to keep moving. Are you an artist? Anna asked, noticing her gaze. Sarah nodded, not taking her eyes off the room. I dreamed of it, but life turned out differently. Anna smiled slightly. And what if I tell you that you can teach here? Sarah slowly turned to her. What? We use art as a way to help people express themselves. Many of those who come here have experienced terrible things. Loss of home, job, family. Some have never held a brush, but when they draw, they speak through color and form. They need someone to help them with this. I've never taught, Sarah whispered. But you know what art is? Sarah nodded. You know how it can change a person? She nodded again, remembering herself. That same girl who dreamed of art school, who escaped from the world by creating worlds on paper. Anna smiled. Then you already know more than enough. Meeting with the past. After the tour, Anna suggested Sarah stay in the dining hall and help serve lunch. She put on an apron and started ladling hot soup until he approached her. That same homeless man. He looked a bit better. His hair was clean, and he wore a new warm coat. But there was still something broken in his eyes. You? He froze, recognizing her. Sarah smiled. I'm glad to see you again. He swallowed, clearly not knowing what to say. I didn't think I'd meet you here. Neither did I, Sarah honestly admitted. He looked at her hands where she held the ladle. Now you work here? I am trying. The man nodded, then looked away, as if gathering his courage. I don't know how to thank you. Sarah shook her head. You don't need to. Just, if you ever can, help someone else. That will be the best thanks. He looked at her for a long time. Then for the first time since they met, he slightly smiled. I'll try. An unexpected visit. As the day came to an end, Sarah left the building, closing her coat against the increasing frost. She was walking to the bus stop when she heard a voice that made her freeze. How was your first day? Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She slowly turned around. Keanu Reeves was leaning against his car by the curb. She blinked. You? What are you doing here? He shrugged. I wanted to find out how you're feeling. Sarah didn't know what to say. Honestly, it was tough, emotional, but at the same time, right. Keanu nodded as if expecting that very answer. Do you know why I chose Hope Horizons? Sarah shook her head. He smiled. Because once they chose me. She looked at him, not believing her ears. You were? He nodded. In my youth, I had tough times. I was alone, but someone believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Now I want to do the same. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She had always thought of him as a distant celebrity, someone whose life was perfect. But now she saw something else. Not an actor, but a person who understood what it meant to be lost, and who helped because someone had once helped him. She took a deep breath. Thank you, Keanu, for everything. He looked at her, his warm eyes smiling. This is just the beginning, Sarah. Several weeks passed. Sarah didn't recognize herself. Every morning she came to Hope Horizons, the center that in this short time had become more than just a job for her. She learned, she helped. She felt that her presence really meant something. In her life for the first time, there was a goal. She didn't just serve food, didn't just talk to the homeless. She saw in their eyes a reflection of herself, that same Sarah who once thought she was nobody. Now she led art classes for people who had once lost hope. They didn't just draw. They poured onto the paper everything they felt. Sadness, loneliness, pain, but also hope. It was evening, rain drizzling outside, when Sarah was cleaning up the studio after another class. She heard laughter from volunteers mixing with the hushed voices of visitors. The room smelled of acrylic paints, coffee, and a hint of wet cardboard. She was about to leave when the door opened. Sarah turned, and her breath caught for a moment. Keanu Reeves stood in the doorway. His coat was speckled with raindrops, his hair slightly damp, but his warm smile hadn't changed. I heard you're working miracles, he said, looking around. Sarah laughed, feeling her heart race. I'm just doing what I can. Keanu nodded, then approached one of the paintings painted by one of the homeless. This is amazing. Sarah looked at him, her voice soft. Thank you, but if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. Keanu looked at her, and his gaze became very serious for a moment. You would have found your way, Sarah. I just helped you see it. She swallowed. He looked at the painting again, but there was something personal in his voice, something painfully familiar. Keanu, Sarah said softly, you know what it's like, don't you? To be lost. He paused for a moment, then slowly nodded. Yes. Sarah didn't know what to say, but at that moment everything fell into place. She no longer saw the actor, the star, the man known by millions. She saw a person who had experienced pain, who knew what it meant to be nobody, but who chose to help others because someone had once helped him. I want to thank you, Sarah suddenly said, surprising herself. Keanu looked at her curiously. And how? She picked up a blank canvas, then handed him a brush. Let's paint something together. He froze, then smiled. I can't draw, Sarah laughed. Everyone says that. She took another brush, dipped it in bright blue paint, and made the first stroke. Just try. Keanu took the brush, looked at her, then at the canvas, and finally made the first stroke. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a moment they would remember forever. A few weeks after that meeting, Sarah found a small package on her desk one day. She unwrapped it, and her heart stopped. Inside was a sketchbook. On the first page, in calligraphic handwriting, it said, "For the artist who paints with kindness, never stop creating." No signature, but Sarah knew who had left it. She smiled and pressed the sketchbook to her chest. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something bigger. Because if one kind act could change her life, who knows how many more lives she would change?